maybe I should just say a very few words briefly to introduce you to the reason that we are here as English people, and the reason that I was fortunate enough and blessed enough to be able to acquire this beautiful property. I was always very interested. I'm not an artist, I'm not an architect. I can't think in three-dimensional terms. I can't draw, but I've loved architecture ever since I was a small boy. And I've also lived in the United States, really in Chicago and New York. And on one occasion I thought to myself, well, if you're so interested in architecture, Peter Palumbo, you should really go and see the great house, which is Falling Water. So I did. I went there in 1984, had lunch there. The director showed me round, and before I left, it was a memorable day, beautiful day. He said, I think you should see the other Frank Lloyd Wright house in Pennsylvania, which is only 6 miles down the road, and by the way, it's for sale. So I beetled over here. There was no one around. It was completely empty. I had the place to myself, walked around the house, fell in love with the outside. I thought to myself, it is as beautiful inside as it is out. Then I must come back and do something about it. So I came back 6 weeks later, met the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Hagen, who were charming, charming people, and I bought the house that afternoon. And the interesting thing was, as I explained to some of you already this evening, the house had been on the market for 3 years, and there had not been one single expression of interest, let alone an offer, during that time. So I like to think the house was waiting for me, and fate was playing its hand, and I was fortunate enough to be here, and, well, the rest is history. Carlos, as our guest, welcome again. What do you think of the high life and times of Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, as I started with my disclaimer, I'm not an authority on Frank Lloyd Wright, but I would like to follow on your introduction to Kentuck Knob, because it seems rather appropriate that you begin with this introduction to a heroic piece of architecture, as Falling Water is. It has become a figure in the landscape of architecture that is immediately recognized as the best of Frank Lloyd Wright, and yet you find this gem of a house completely nestled in this hill that suddenly makes you even forget that momentary love affair with Falling Water. So this idea that Frank Lloyd Wright could exist in this realm, this not oppositional realm, but can exist with the magnitude of this muscular work in this river, this creek. Sorry, I don't need to sound like a Texan suddenly exaggerating a creek into a river, but you know what I mean. But I love this idea that you fell in love with this humble house, with someone that was forgetting his passage on earth, and then you found this moving portrait to invest that afternoon. That I find that story quite amazing, and more so than I'm sure we'll get to the high times, but I have not heard this story so strategically placed in one afternoon, that you fell in love with the house and decided to buy it after that encounter. But I
told my wife when we met that I fall in love very easily.
That can be dangerous. And we seem to share a kind of fascination with an individual that, if you think about it, there are very few Americans that have done this. I'm not, I think of my present hero, Bob Dylan, who has manufactured a life of many dimensions, like Wright did, and always a rebirth. You know, it's a kind of fascinating American tradition of this rebirth. It's a place where you don't need to be in allegiance with some particular heritage or lineage. You can rebirth yourself. And Frank Lloyd Wright represents that kind of instantaneous rebirth.
But I like the idea of comparing him with Bob Dylan, because of course Bob Dylan obviously was Robert Zimmerman and became Bob Dylan.
Yes.
And Bob Dylan...
And invents his life. Really.
And not only invents his life, but constantly is reinventing what he's doing. And Wright is one of those architects who seems to have had this ability to surprise us. Every couple of years he would pull a new rabbit out of the hat, let's say. And I think there's something, going back to this issue about Americanness, I think he is one of the great, in fact, American artists.
Yes.
In part because, and I should of course also say that this year is the 150th anniversary of his birth, right? Which is why we're here, I think, for these for these events. He had an incredibly long life. So he lived to be, what, 92? 91,
well, depends who you believe.
It's often a little unsure with Frank Lloyd Wright.
67, 69.
Yeah, but he had a very, very long life.
Yes.
And this notion of Americanness, I think, which is so central to him, in fact, and maybe to Bob Dylan as well, it's not by chance that they came from the middle of America, not from the coasts. And if you think about architecture in America in the late 19th century, the expected thing to do for a brilliant young architect was to go to Paris. So if you were, in Boston or in New York, off you went to the Beaux-Arts, like Richardson, for example, or Sullivan, or Henry Hornbostel, our own Henry Hornbostel in Pittsburgh, who I think is a greatly underrated architect. That was the thing you were supposed to do, and Wright didn't do that, in part because I think he didn't have the funds to do that. But there's something about his spirit in Wisconsin that is quintessentially American in the sense of a democratic America.
I think he felt that he was born under a star. I mean, there are people like that, and they are infinitely interesting. People, you can call it arrogance, you can call it conceit, you can call it genius, and it's all those things. But there are people around who are definitely feel that they're born under a star and that they can do anything, and that they can take anyone in any direction that they like to do. I really think that he is one of the greatest architects, not simply of his time, which started in the 19th century, but of all time. And it was interesting when I had the privilege of knowing Mies van der Rohe towards the end of his life. He was 75 when I first met him. I think I was 24. But he was my hero. I started from that thing. And Mies was a man of few words. Frank Lloyd Wright was a man of many words.
the Welsh Celtic gene.
I mean, he wrote in his life over 100,000 letters. I mean, extraordinary wordsmith. But Mies said to me that when Frank Lloyd Wright came or was forced to go to Germany in the early part of the 20th century, and exhibited a small collection of his drawings in Berlin in 1911. Mies said that they didn't know his work. I mean, it seems ridiculous nowadays, but they did not know his work, and that when they saw it, not only Mies, but Behrens and all the people there, Gropius, for them, life was never the same again. Mies, of course, came over to the United States in 1937-38 to escape the Nazi regime. And he was followed by a town planner, very famous town planner, called Hilbersheim. And they met Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago, and for some event or other. It might have been the event when Frank Lloyd Wright he was a mentor of Mies van der Rohe. He introduced him to the American establishment and the American architectural profession. And it was a famous occasion when he got up at a big dinner for the Armour Institute, which Mies had been made a director of. It's now called IIT in Chicago, but it was then called the Armour Institute. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mies van der Rohe. Without me, there would be no Mies van der Rohe." typical Frank Lloyd, and sat down. That was the end of the speech. And then he walked off the platform.
But you know, Peter, following on that, I mean, one of my favorite quotes about Wright's extreme confidence, I would say, is that when he was interviewed, actually in Houston, and he was interviewed, and he said, "So, Mr. Wright, how do you came to be an architect?" He said, "Well, first of all, I never tried to be an architect. I never was educated to be an architect. And least of all, I was never mentored to be an architect. I was born an architect." And it was during a time when he got the gold medal in 1949, I believe. And he was his typical confident self to insult the host of right away by he was taken to this fantastic hotel that was the pride of Houston at the time, and it was called, sadly for the host, the Shamrock. And Mr. Wright looked at the Shamrock and he says, "Well, what do you think, Mr. Wright? This is our pride and joy." And he says, "Well, he looks to me like a lot of sham and very little rock." And sure enough, it was very truthful, because the hotel only lasted maybe 3 decades, and it was actually built out of plastic formica that looked like marble and things like that. So it was really a kind of sham, but he didn't know that. So his kind of instinct to be so receptive to something that was visceral to his sensibility, was very striking.
And he had this ability, this isn't of course taught in architecture schools, but he had an ability to perhaps every decade or so, he could find a great client. And when I say a great client, I don't mean the client for one project, I mean the client for multiple projects. So the Martins in Buffalo, for example. And then, of course, Mr. Kaufman here in Pittsburgh. And, of course, the Prices then in Bartlesville in Oklahoma in the 50s. So he had this ability of finding these very interesting clients. So this was a way for him to bounce back. He could convince these clients to build many more things. So Mr. Price, for example, the man in Oklahoma, in Bartlesville, their business was in oil pipelines. And his sons were encouraged to think about architecture because they were at the University of Oklahoma and they're an inspirational teacher. And that's often a very important thing, of course. And so Mr. Price went to see Mr. Wright. And he went in, his own joke, slightly at his own expense, is that he went in expecting that Mr. Wright would design a 3-story office building in the center of Bartlesville. And his joke is that as he left the meeting, he said, "Well, we compromised on 18 stories."
It's still standing.
It's still standing.
It's a great hotel now.
So Wright had this idea in his mind about making a high-rise based upon a tree. So again, an organic idea. Of course, this is his big thing, organic architecture. And he'd proposed a project like this at many stages, but never was able to realize it. So I think when he saw Mr. Price wandering in, looking for a 3-story high office building, he thought, "I found my man."
And the other wonderful story, wonderful story was that at the Guggenheim Museum, which, as you know, goes round and round and round and round and round. The then director, James Johnson Sweeney, wondered how the inaugural exhibition was Jackson Pollock, big paintings, 10 feet long and 4 or 5 feet high, and how was he going to hang these on a curving wall? So they went round to the storage place where these paintings were due to be hung, with Frank Lloyd Wright, and he said, "Mr. Wright, this is a very beautiful building, but how can I possibly hang a painting which is 10 feet long and 4 or 5 feet high on a curving wall?" And Frank Lloyd Wright went up to it, and he looked at it, and he came up to it, and he looked, and he went back, And then he pointed with his cane. He said, "This is about the middle of the painting. This is where we make the cut."